Thank you very much. What I'd like to do today is invite you to think about our planet maybe a little bit differently than we normally do. I'd like you to think about planet Earth as a form of wealth. Wealth involves a structure of rights and responsibilities and always poses the question, to whom does this wealth belong? And what I want to suggest to you is that when we think about our planetary wealth, it belongs to all of us, to current and future generations, to every woman, man, and child in equal and common measure. And I want to think with you in particular about how that understanding of our planetary wealth and how that understanding of it as our commonwealth impacts on what we should do in thinking about managing an important aspect of that wealth, which is the Earth's climate. Treating our planet as wealth doesn't mean turning it into a commodity. It doesn't mean putting the planet up for sale. Nor does it mean, however, valuing the use of our wealth at zero, which is precisely what we've been doing for a long time when it comes to our climate. The problem of global climate change is what economists call a problem of open access, sometimes called the tragedy of open access. And the problem is that when access to a resource that's in limited supply is free, people will use that resource as if it were unlimited in supply, as if it were costless to use it, and in so doing will overuse and abuse that resource to the point where the very existence of the resource, its survival, is endangered. This tragedy of open access is sometimes also called the tragedy of the commons. But it's only a tragedy if the people who depend on this resource, the people who live on planet Earth in this case, the commoners, fail to organize themselves to manage the wealth responsibly. In other words, it depends, in this case, on all of us, because in the case of our planetary wealth, we are the commoners. The kind of problem we have with putting too much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into our atmosphere is not an unfamiliar problem. We face this problem in many aspects of our economy, and we've learned many ways to deal with the problem. It's a problem known as congestion. So take, for example, the problem of where to park our cars. We have parking lots. We have ways to manage the use of those parking lots. One of those ways is to install parking meters so that people have to pay to use the limited parking space. This helps prevent the space from being overcrowded. Notice that charging to use the parking space doesn't mean turning the parking lot into a commodity that's for sale. It doesn't mean selling the parking lot. In some cases, the parking places are along a public street. When we charge people to park there, we're not selling the street, we're merely charging them to use the limited resource. The question is, can we similarly put a price on carbon, on parking carbon in the Earth's atmosphere? And the answer is yes, we can do it. There are two basic ways to put a price on carbon emissions. One way is to charge a certain amount for every ton of carbon that we put in there. The price is invariant. The amount is up to people who are willing to pay the price to decide. That's called a tax. In this case, it's called a carbon tax. A second way to do it is to put a cap on the total amount of carbon we're going to allow into our economy and ultimately into the atmosphere, and let the demand for those permits determine the price. That's called a carbon cap. The two are totally equivalent, the only difference being that a tax sets the price and allows the quantity to adjust. A cap sets the quantity and allows the price to adjust. In the case of carbon emissions, because the most important target, what we really want to hit, is the quantity of emissions. We want to reduce that gradually over time to a level that won't overburden the Earth any more than we've already done. In that case, using the cap probably is a better way to try to be sure we hit the target than using a tax. But other than that, the two mechanisms are equivalent. They both charge money for putting carbon in that atmospheric parking lot. Charging money, or in any other way regulating access to the global atmosphere as a sink for our carbon emissions, involves the creation of a kind of property. The opposite of open access is property. So if our starting point is non-existence of property, totally open access, where anybody can dump as much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as they wish, we can create property in various ways to address that problem. One way we can do so is to impose regulations. So in the case of a parking lot, for example, we paint lines on the pavement to show where you can park. We put up signs showing that these are spaces reserved for people with disabilities. Those are regulations. But we also, very often, put a price on the parking space in order to bring demand in line with the limited supply. Putting a price on the spaces means that we're taking a step beyond regulation. We're saying it's okay to park here, it's legal to park here, but if you want to park, it's not free. In a similar fashion, if we think about carbon, we can think about various sorts of regulations. We already have some kinds of regulations. Fuel efficiency standards for automobiles, for example, renewable portfolio standards for electricity generation. We have various battles going on about whether or not to build the Keystone pipeline, whether to allow large parts of our country to be fracked up by exploration and drilling for natural gas. These are regulatory issues, and they're important issues. I don't want to say that regulation's not an important part of the puzzle, but what I do want to suggest to you is that just because certain things are allowed by our regulations doesn't mean they should necessarily be free. Just because we allow certain kinds of combustion of fossil fuel subject to the regulations we create doesn't mean we shouldn't charge a price for it. Charging a price is terribly important because it gives people an incentive to invest in energy efficiency and new energy technologies, whereas the regulations are really, it's almost like you're trying to build a dam against the flow of a river. But gravity is trying to pull that river, the water down through that dam and around that dam. The regulations are holding it back. Well, if you don't fix the price structure with respect to the incentives to put carbon in the atmosphere, you're constantly fighting this battle to push back the water that's trying to flow to what's cheap, what's unpriced, what's zero priced. But if you put a price on it, you can alter those incentives in ways that can promote the kind of technological changes that we will ultimately need to see. In terms of what it costs polluters to limit access to our global carbon sink, in the case of regulatory standards, polluters do have to pay something. They have to pay the costs of abiding by the regulations, what economists call abatement costs. They have to pay to do whatever it takes, you know, to get higher fuel efficiency in automobiles, etc. In the case of price-based regulation, where we also put a price on emissions, polluters not only have to pay the cost of abatement, they also have to pay the price of the emissions that they don't abate, the emissions that are not prevented. Jurists, legal scholars often describe property rights as a bundle of sticks. There isn't just one property right, there are a number of different property rights. And in terms of that bundle of sticks, when we put regulations in place to deal with the open access problem, we are putting in place one stick in the bundle of property rights. It's a stick that allows us to set rules governing access to the resource, so it's no longer open access. In the case of putting prices on as well for parking or for putting carbon into the atmosphere, we're inserting another stick into that bundle of property rights, and that's the right to receive income from use of the resource. Now, if we think about that last right, it poses a really interesting and important question, and this is what I really want to focus on now, which is who pays and who gets the money. If we're going to have a system where it costs money to put carbon in the atmosphere, who's going to pay and who's going to receive the money? This is the multi-trillion-dollar question that we will face in the next few decades. Putting a cap on our carbon emissions, or equivalently taxing those emissions, means that in the end, consumers will pay in proportion to their use of the scarce resource, in proportion to their so-called carbon footprints. And the question is, who will get the money that you and I all pay in higher prices for gasoline, electricity, and everything produced and distributed using fossil fuels? There are three possible answers to that question. One of them is that the money goes to the fossil fuel corporations. The second is that the money goes to the government. And the third is that the money comes back to the people. The first option is what I call cap and giveaway and trade. Under cap and giveaway and trade, free permits are given to existing polluters. The simplest way to distribute permits is to distribute them and collect them where the fossil fuels enter the economy, at the pipeline terminal, tanker terminal, mine head, etc. Give those people the permits. Usually the way that's advocated being done is on the basis of some formula involving their historic emissions. That's a system that sometimes is called grandfathering. I guess I'm getting sensitive at this stage in my life. I think of that as kind of an ageist and sexist term, grandfathering. So what I call it is giveaway. And when you give away the permits, you have to be able to trade the permits because some firms get more than they need and some need more than they get, so they need to be traded among themselves. That's where the phrase cap and trade comes from. A more complete description would be cap and giveaway and trade, because unless you give them away, you don't need to trade them. The money that comes back to the corporations ultimately gets distributed amongst the people on the basis of their ownership of corporate stocks, fossil fuel company stocks in particular, and some of those profits flow to foreign shareholders. Some of those profits leak out of the country to others who own those stocks. The second option is cap and spend. In this case, the money goes to the government. The permits are auctioned off, not given away. There's no need for permit trading. It's not the same as cap and trade. The government then uses that money as it wishes. It may decide to use it to spend on things. It may decide to cut other taxes. How you feel about that probably depends on how you feel about the government. And the final possibility is that the money comes back to the people. This is what's called cap and dividend. Dividend is one of the names given to the money that comes back to each and every one of us in the form of a monthly check in the mail, or more likely an electronic transfer that we can access at our friendly ATM machines. In this case, again, the permits are auctioned. They're not given away. There's no need for permit trading. The revenue is recycled to the public as equal dividends per person. Equal dividends to every man, woman, and child, much as revenue in the Alaska Permanent Fund from the drilling of oil in Alaska currently goes into a fund from which an annual dividend is distributed to every man, woman, and child in the state of Alaska. The big difference between the Alaska Permanent Fund and what I'm talking about is that in the case of the Alaska Permanent Fund, the people of Alaska have an incentive to pump more oil to get more dividends. In the case of a cap and dividend system, we all have incentives to tighten down that cap, because the rate at which we reduce emissions is slower than the rate at which the prices have to rise to achieve those reductions. So the total amount of money in the pot goes up as we tighten down the cap. One of the great attractions of cap and dividend is that it would protect the purchasing power of working families, of the middle class and low-income families across the country in the face of rising fuel prices. It would make people whole, make most of the people whole. Those who have big carbon footprints, who tend to be the most affluent people in our society, who, by the way, can afford this, would pay more in higher prices than they get back in their dividends, but most of us would get back more than we pay into the pot. The principle underlying cap and dividend is the principle that I referred to at the very beginning, that our planetary wealth belongs to us all in equal and common measure. It belongs to future generations as well as to the present generation. That's why we not only have a right to use that wealth, but we have a responsibility to protect it for future generations. Part of that responsibility is to avoid catastrophic climate change. It also means that those of us who are using the wealth today deserve to share equally in its benefit. The principle is expressed in this mural that is on the wall of the Ministry of Public Education in Mexico City, a mural. This is a piece of a mural painted by the great artist Diego Rivera. Rivera penned the inscription that says, "The earth belongs to all of us, like the air, like the water, like the light, and like the heat of the sun." I want to suggest that if we take that ethical principle seriously, we can translate it into a policy that potentially can resolve our current political impasse over climate action in the United States. Economists are notoriously unreliable in making predictions, but I'll make a prediction right now. I predict that if you go do a poll, if you ask your friends and your neighbors, okay, if we charge for using the limited carbon space in our atmosphere, where should the money go? Should it go to the fossil fuel corporations? Should it go to the government? Or should it be returned back to the people? That the majority will vote for returning the money to the people. The majority will vote for that based on this same principle that you can see in Diego Rivera's mural. I think that's going to be true of people in red states as well as in blue states and everywhere in between. And I think it can provide the foundation for a successful bipartisan climate policy that will pass Congress and that will endure over the 40 years or so that we need to make the clean energy transition. So I invite you to think about translating the principles into practice. This won't happen because politicians in Washington suddenly decide it's a good idea. It'll only happen if you tell them it's a good idea. It's called democracy, and I want to make a plea to you today to play your part in making the change that we want to see. Thank you very much.